You really think you belong in first class? The question sliced through the cabin before the plane had even finished boarding. A few passengers turned immediately, their conversations fading beneath the soft hum of overhead air vents and the distant rumble of rain against the runway outside. Claire Whitmore stood in the aisle of Atlantic Meridian Flight 221, one manicured hand resting on the leather seat beside 2A, her perfect smile already gone cold. Isaiah Brooks slowly lifted his eyes from the tablet in his lap. He sat calmly beneath the warm amber reading light, dressed in a faded black hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers that still carried drops of rain from the terminal floor. Nothing about him looked expensive. Nothing about him looked like the kind of man Atlantic Meridian proudly featured in its glossy first-class advertisements. Claire glanced once at the boarding pass in his hand, then at the older white businessman standing beside her clutching a designer suitcase. There must be some mistake, the businessman muttered loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. That's my seat. Isaiah's voice stayed even. No, sir. Your seat is 3C. The businessman frowned. Claire barely looked at the scanner in her hand before shaking her head. Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the seat while we sort this out. Isaiah didn't move. Outside the oval window beside him, rainwater streaked across the glass beneath the blinking airport lights. I already checked twice, he replied quietly. This is my seat. Claire crossed her arms tighter. Around them, expensive watches glimmered beneath cabin lights while passengers exchanged subtle looks over champagne glasses and open laptops. Somewhere farther back, a baby cried briefly before falling silent again. Sir, Claire said, lowering her voice into something sharper, we can do this the easy way or the difficult way. Isaiah studied her face for a moment. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Like he had lived through this exact moment too many times before. He reached slowly into his pocket and handed her the boarding pass. First class, 2A. Claire's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The businessman beside her leaned closer. Unbelievable, he scoffed under his breath. Claire handed the ticket back immediately. Tickets can be altered, she said flatly. I need you to come with me. A few rows away, someone quietly pulled out a phone. Isaiah exhaled once through his nose and closed the tablet on his lap. Ma'am, he said calmly, check the manifest again. The sentence hung in the air for half a second too long. Claire's cheeks flushed beneath the cabin lighting. Her smile disappeared completely now, replaced by the rigid professionalism of someone no longer pretending to be polite. Do not tell me how to do my job, she snapped. Then, before anyone fully understood what was happening, her hand moved sharply through the narrow aisle. The sound cracked across the silent cabin like a dropped glass. A little boy seated across the aisle jumped in surprise, nearly spilling orange juice across his tray table. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Isaiah's head turned slightly from the impact before settling back forward again. The left side of his face reddened beneath the soft gold light overhead. Claire's breathing quickened. I said, she whispered coldly, leave the seat. Isaiah looked at her for 3 long seconds. Then he slowly reached for his phone, unlocked the screen, and said in a voice so calm it somehow felt heavier than shouting, Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? The silence inside the cabin thickened until even the soft instrumental boarding music felt distant. Claire Whitmore stood frozen beside seat 2A, her chest rising slightly faster now as dozens of eyes locked onto her. Isaiah Brooks lowered his phone onto the armrest without breaking eye contact. He did not touch his face. He did not raise his voice. Somehow that made the tension worse. The businessman beside Claire cleared his throat awkwardly and adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit. This is getting ridiculous, he muttered, though his confidence had already started slipping. Across the aisle, a woman slowly removed her noise-canceling headphones. Another passenger angled his phone higher, pretending to text while the camera pointed directly toward the confrontation. Beyond the rain streaked. Windows, baggage carts crawled across the wet tarmac beneath flashing amber lights. Claire straightened her posture, forcing authority back into her voice. Security will escort you off this aircraft if necessary. Isaiah nodded once, calm as still water. That will not be necessary. He picked up the phone again and typed something slowly with one thumb. The glow from the screen reflected briefly across his dark eyes before disappearing again. Claire watched him with visible irritation. To her, he looked exactly like the kind of passenger she had spent years learning to filter out. Too casual. Too confident without permission. Atlantic Meridian marketed luxury, exclusivity, image. And Claire had built her entire career around protecting that image. She had memorized wine lists worth more than most monthly rent payments. She knew which senators preferred sparkling water before takeoff and which celebrities hated eye contact from staff. She could identify inherited wealth from the stitching on a jacket sleeve alone. That talent had earned her promotions, praise from executives, and invitations to elite corporate events most employees never touched. In her mind, first class belonged to a very specific kind of person. Isaiah Brooks did not fit the picture. Not with the scuffed sneakers. Not with the rain-damp hoodie. Not with skin that made certain passengers instantly suspicious before he even spoke. Claire hated admitting that part to herself, so she buried it beneath words like professionalism and standards. But somewhere deep down, she knew exactly why she had reacted the moment she saw him seated in 2A. Isaiah leaned back quietly while voices murmured around him like distant static. He had seen those looks before. Airports in Dallas. Hotels in Boston. Luxury restaurants in Los Angeles. Places where expensive rooms suddenly became colder when he walked in wearing simple clothes instead of tailored suits. 20 years earlier, Isaiah had loaded baggage carts at Midway Airport during overnight shifts while attending community college classes during the day. He remembered the ache in his shoulders after stacking suitcases in January wind that cut through gloves. Like ice water. He remembered businessmen walking past him without ever seeing his face. Back then, he promised himself something during those freezing midnight shifts. If he ever became successful, he would never need expensive clothes to prove it. The older flight attendant near the galley finally stepped forward carefully. "Claire," she whispered under her breath, "maybe we should verify with the gate first." Claire did not look away from Isaiah. "I already know what I saw." Isaiah's phone vibrated softly in his hand. One new email confirmation appeared on the screen. Sent successfully. Outside, thunder rolled low across the runway. Then somewhere near the front of the aircraft, another phone suddenly began ringing. The ringing phone near the cockpit continued for several long seconds before finally stopping. Another began almost immediately after. Then another. The atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted in a way nobody could fully explain yet. Flight attendants near the front exchanged uncertain looks while passengers pretended not to stare. Claire Whitmore folded her arms tighter, though the confidence in her posture had started cracking around the edges. Isaiah Brooks remained seated beneath the soft cabin light, one hand resting calmly on the armrest while rain tapped steadily against the windows beside him. The older attendant near the galley glanced nervously toward the front curtain separating first class from the cockpit corridor. "Something is wrong," she whispered. Claire exhaled sharply. "Nothing is wrong." But even she no longer sounded convinced. Near row 4, the businessman who originally claimed seat 2A quietly slid into his actual seat without another word. He avoided looking directly at Isaiah now. Across the aisle, a teenage boy lowered his phone slightly and whispered to his mother, "Do you think he is famous or something?" The woman shook her head carefully, but her eyes never left Isaiah's face. He did not look famous. That was the strange part. No designer watch flashed beneath the lights. No security team surrounded him. No luxury branding covered his clothes. He looked like someone people passed every day without noticing. And maybe that was exactly why Claire had made her mistake. Her entire career depended on reading people quickly. For 6 years she had worked Atlantic Meridian's premium international routes between New York, London, Dubai, and Los Angeles. Executives praised her instincts. Wealthy travelers requested her by name. She knew which passengers tipped generously and which ones treated staff like invisible furniture. She had learned how power usually dressed. Tailored cashmere. Italian leather. Platinum status tags hanging from expensive luggage. In her experience, the truly important people always wanted everyone around them to know exactly who they were. Isaiah Brooks broke every one of those rules. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as thunder rolled outside again, low and heavy across the runway. Somewhere beneath the floor, luggage containers slammed shut. The plane should have already pushed back from the gate 15 minutes earlier. Instead, nobody moved. Claire finally turned toward Isaiah again. "Sir," she said, forcing control back into her tone, "whatever game you think you are playing, delaying this aircraft is not going to help you." Isaiah looked up slowly. His voice stayed soft enough that nearby passengers leaned forward to hear it clearly. This was never about delaying a plane. Claire opened her mouth to answer when the curtain near the cockpit suddenly pulled open. A man in a dark navy suit stepped quickly into first class, breathing harder than someone trained to stay composed. His silver company badge swung sharply against his jacket as he scanned the cabin. Daniel Mercer, Atlantic Meridian's Senior Operations Director for the East Coast Division. Claire's expression changed instantly. "Mr. Mercer," she said, startled. Daniel ignored her completely at first. His eyes moved across the cabin row by row until they landed on Isaiah. Then the color drained from his face so quickly it almost looked painful. The entire cabin seemed to inhale at once. Daniel walked forward carefully, his polished shoes barely making sound against the carpeted aisle. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his coat like he had rushed across the tarmac himself. When he finally stopped beside seat 2A, he swallowed once before speaking. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "I was told there has been a misunderstanding." Claire blinked in confusion. Misunderstanding. Not disturbance. Not security issue. Misunderstanding. Isaiah held Daniel's gaze for a moment before answering. "That depends," he said calmly. "How expensive do you think this misunderstanding is about to become?" Daniel Mercer stood motionless beside seat 2A for one strained second before forcing himself to breathe normally again. The overhead lights reflected against the thin layer of rainwater still clinging to his coat collar. Around him, first class had become unnaturally quiet. Even the passengers pretending not to listen had stopped moving entirely. Claire Whitmore looked between the two men with growing confusion. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "this passenger refused instructions and became disruptive during boarding." Daniel finally turned toward her. The expression on his face was not anger yet. Somehow that made it worse. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated. The confidence that usually carried her through every difficult interaction suddenly felt unstable beneath her feet. "No," she admitted. Daniel looked back toward Isaiah immediately, like even making Claire answer had been a mistake. "Mr. Brooks," he said, lowering his voice further, "I just got off the phone with corporate." Isaiah rested his phone against his knee. "Then you already know why this plane is still sitting at the gate." Daniel swallowed hard. Outside the window, lightning flashed faintly beyond the clouds, briefly illuminating the wet runway in cold white light. Somewhere deeper inside the aircraft, a seatbelt latch clicked sharply in the silence. Claire stepped closer now, her heels sinking softly into the carpet runner between seats. "I think someone needs to explain what is happening," she said, trying to recover authority. Daniel turned toward her slowly. "The acquisition contract for Atlantic Meridian was terminated 9 minutes ago." The words landed across the cabin heavier than turbulence. A passenger near row 3 lowered his newspaper completely. Another quietly removed his glasses. Claire blinked once. What acquisition contract? Daniel stared at her in disbelief. The $400 million emergency investment package. Her face lost color almost instantly. For the past 6 months, rumors about the deal had spread quietly through executive offices and employee lounges across the airline. Atlantic Meridian had been bleeding money after failed international expansions, maintenance lawsuits, and fuel losses that nearly crippled the company the previous winter. Entire departments knew layoffs were coming if the investment collapsed. Some believed bankruptcy would follow within the year. Claire had heard all of it. Every employee had. But she never imagined the man controlling that deal would look like Isaiah Brooks. Daniel rubbed one trembling hand across his jaw before speaking again. Mr. Brooks represents Blackridge Capital. A murmur spread softly through the cabin. Even passengers outside the business world recognized the name. Blackridge Capital did not rescue struggling companies unless they believed those companies deserved saving. Isaiah looked toward the rain-covered window again. Represented, he corrected quietly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The correction hit like a door slamming shut. Claire stared at Isaiah now as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Her breathing became shallow. No, she whispered. That cannot be right. Isaiah finally looked back at her. There was no triumph in his expression. No cruelty. Just disappointment worn deep into exhaustion. You asked whether I belonged in first class, he said softly. The truth is I was trying to decide whether your airline deserved to survive at all. Nobody moved. Somewhere in the back of the cabin, ice shifted inside a glass with a faint crackling sound. Claire's posture weakened slightly, one hand gripping the nearest seat for balance. Daniel glanced anxiously toward Isaiah's phone. Sir, he said carefully, the board is requesting a call immediately. The chief executive officer is on his way here now. Isaiah nodded once but made no effort to stand. He should hurry, he replied calmly. Because after tonight, there may not be much of an airline left to save. The cabin no longer felt like the inside of a commercial airplane. It felt like a courtroom moments before a verdict nobody wanted to hear. Rain continued sliding across the windows in silver streaks while the aircraft sat motionless at the gate beneath flashing runway lights. Daniel Mercer remained beside seat 2A, one hand pressed against the back of an empty chair as though steadying himself physically might somehow steady the situation around him. Claire Whitmore had stopped speaking entirely. Her face had gone pale beneath the soft amber lighting, and for the first time since boarding began, she looked uncertain of where to place her hands, where to stand, or even where to look. Isaiah Brooks sat quietly in the center of the silence he never asked to create. He opened his phone again, calmly scrolling through incoming messages while the entire first-class cabin watched him with a mixture of confusion and growing fear. One notification after another illuminated the screen. Board members. Legal teams. Financial analysts. Every message carried the same urgency. The deal was collapsing. Daniel's company phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. Yes, sir, he said, voice strained. He is still on board. A pause. Daniel glanced at Isaiah before lowering his voice further. No, sir. I do not think threatening him would be wise. Several nearby passengers exchanged quick looks after hearing that sentence. Claire felt her stomach tighten. She had spent years mastering difficult travelers, demanding executives, and spoiled celebrities. But this was different. Those people wanted attention. Isaiah Brooks wanted nothing at all, and somehow that made him impossible to control. The older attendant near the galley quietly approached Claire. You need to apologize, she whispered carefully. Claire swallowed hard. I cannot just walk over there now. You already walked over there before. The words hit harder than Claire expected. Across the aisle, the businessman who had first challenged Isaiah suddenly stood up awkwardly. Listen, he muttered nervously, adjusting his tie again, I think maybe everybody got off on the wrong foot here. Isaiah looked at him briefly but said nothing. The man sat back down almost immediately under the weight of that silence. Then the curtain near the front entrance opened again. This time 2 airport security officers stepped on board, followed closely by a tall gray-haired man in a dark overcoat despite the humid summer rain outside. Richard Holloway, Chief Executive Officer of Atlantic Meridian Airlines. The entire cabin stiffened instantly. Claire's heart dropped into her stomach. She had only seen Holloway in person twice before at annual corporate events. Executives spoke about him like royalty. Holloway's eyes swept through the cabin rapidly before landing on Isaiah. The tension in his face became visible immediately. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. He walked down the aisle quickly, ignoring every passenger staring at him now. Daniel stepped aside without a word. Holloway stopped directly beside Isaiah's seat. For one long moment, neither man spoke. The rain tapping against the windows suddenly sounded louder than the engines themselves. Finally Holloway forced out a breath. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "I came here as fast as I could." Isaiah looked up slowly. "You should have come before your employee put her hands on a paying passenger." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Holloway turned toward her with disbelief already spreading across his face. "Claire," he said slowly, "tell me that is not true." Her lips parted, but no words came out. That silence answered everything. Holloway looked physically sick for a second. He rubbed one hand over his mouth before turning back toward Isaiah again. "Sir," he said carefully, "Atlantic Meridian values every customer equally." Isaiah's expression did not change. "No," he replied softly. "Your airline values appearances equally. There is a difference." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loudly. Somewhere outside, lightning flashed again across the rain-soaked runway while the future of an entire airline quietly trembled inside seat 2A. No one inside the cabin seemed willing to move anymore. The earlier tension had transformed into something quieter now, heavier, like the moment after a storm when people finally begin noticing the damage around them. Rain slid slowly down the aircraft windows in long silver lines while distant runway lights shimmered through the darkness outside. Richard Holloway remained standing beside seat 2A, his expensive overcoat still damp from the weather, though he no longer looked like the powerful head of a billion-dollar airline. He looked like a man trying desperately to stop something from collapsing in front of him. Isaiah Brooks sat calmly beneath the soft overhead light, his phone resting face down in his lap now. He had stopped answering messages entirely. Claire Whitmore stood several feet away near the aisle, unable to meet anyone's eyes for more than a second at a time. Her perfectly styled appearance suddenly felt fragile against the silence pressing through the cabin. The older flight attendant near the galley quietly handed a nervous passenger a fresh napkin after his drink began trembling in his hand. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Even whispers felt inappropriate now. Holloway finally lowered himself carefully into the empty seat across from Isaiah. The leather creaked softly beneath his weight. "Mr. Brooks," he said after a long pause, "I know an apology cannot undo what happened tonight." Isaiah looked toward the rain outside the window instead of answering immediately. His reflection blurred faintly against the dark glass. "No," he said softly. "It cannot." Holloway nodded once, staring down at his hands. For the first time in years, he looked exhausted rather than authoritative. "This airline employs over 20,000 people," he said quietly. "Pilots. Mechanics. Flight attendants. Ground crews. Families who depend on these jobs." Isaiah's expression remained unreadable. "And how many of them have been judged before they even opened their mouths?" Holloway did not answer. Somewhere near the back of first class, a flight attendant quietly closed an overhead compartment that nobody had noticed remained open. The click echoed strangely through the still cabin. Isaiah leaned back slightly, his voice remaining calm, almost reflective now. You know what the funny thing is? He asked softly. Holloway looked up. I almost cancelled this meeting last week. Holloway blinked once. Isaiah continued watching the rain as he spoke. I used to load baggage carts overnight at Midway Airport when I was 19 years old. Winter shifts. 2 in the morning. -10 degrees with wind cutting through every layer you wore. Several passengers listened silently now, completely still. Every night I watched planes take off carrying people who looked straight through workers like us, Isaiah continued. Some of them treated janitors better than baggage crews. Some treated baggage crews better than people cleaning bathrooms. Everybody ranking human beings without even realizing they were doing it. Claire slowly lowered her eyes toward the carpet beneath her feet. Isaiah noticed but did not stop speaking. I told myself something back then, he said quietly. If I ever ended up sitting in first class one day, I would never need expensive clothes to prove I earned the seat. Thunder rolled faintly outside again, softer now, farther away across the wet runway. Holloway rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. You built Black Ridge Capital from nothing, he said. Isaiah gave a small nod. My mother cleaned airport bathrooms for 14 years. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Holloway looked down immediately. Claire's eyes closed briefly as though something inside her had finally cracked open completely. Isaiah folded his hands together loosely. Do you understand what hurts the most? He asked quietly. It was not the embarrassment. Holloway looked back up carefully. Isaiah's voice never rose above a calm conversation. It was watching an entire cabin believe her before they believed me. Nobody in first class moved at all after that. The rain kept falling outside the windows while the aircraft remained frozen at the gate, suspended somewhere between departure and reckoning. For several long seconds after Isaiah finished speaking, nobody inside the aircraft seemed capable of making a sound. The soft rainfall outside the windows had become the only steady rhythm left in the cabin. Richard Holloway sat motionless across from him, shoulders lower now than when he first boarded the plane, while Claire Whitmore remained standing near the aisle like someone suddenly realizing the ground beneath her life was no longer stable. The glow from the overhead lights reflected faintly against the moisture gathering in her eyes, though she blinked quickly as if refusing to let anyone notice. Isaiah Brooks looked down at his hands quietly. Calm. Controlled. Untouched by the panic moving through everyone else around him. Then Daniel Mercer's phone vibrated again. Hard. Sharp enough this time that several passengers visibly flinched. Daniel glanced at the screen and immediately looked toward Holloway. Sir, he said carefully, the board is all on the line. Holloway rubbed both hands across his face slowly before standing. Put them through. Daniel activated speaker mode reluctantly. Static crackled once through the cabin before multiple anxious voices poured into the silence at once. Richard, what is happening? The Asian markets open in less than 6 hours. Do you understand what losing Blackridge means? The stock will collapse by morning. Holloway raised one hand for silence. I understand. A colder voice cut through the others immediately after. No, Richard. I do not think you do. The entire cabin went still again. Even Isaiah lifted his eyes slightly at the sound of the voice. Eleanor Grant. Founder of Blackridge Capital. The woman financial magazines called the most feared investor on the East Coast. Her voice remained perfectly calm through the speaker. Mr. Brooks informed me of the incident 20 minutes ago. Holloway's throat tightened visibly. Eleanor, please allow me to personally resolve this. Resolve? Eleanor repeated softly. One of my senior partners was publicly humiliated aboard your aircraft by an employee representing your company. In front of witnesses. After we spent 7 months negotiating a rescue package to keep your airline alive. Nobody dared interrupt her. Claire's breathing became uneven now. The older flight attendant near the galley quietly looked away, almost unable to watch anymore. Eleanor continued speaking in the same measured tone. Do you know why Isaiah handles most of our transportation? Investments personally. Holloway answered carefully. Because he built the aviation division. No, Eleanor replied. Because he understands people better than anyone in this industry. He sees value where others only see appearance. Isaiah lowered his eyes again, almost uncomfortable hearing the praise spoken aloud. Eleanor's voice softened slightly after a brief pause. That young man used to sleep 4 hours a night while unloading cargo planes and studying economics textbooks during meal breaks. Every dollar he earned went toward helping his mother survive. Holloway stared silently at Isaiah now, as though finally understanding the full weight of the person sitting across from him. Blackridge trusted Atlantic Meridian because Isaiah believed your company still deserved saving, Eleanor continued. If he no longer believes that, neither do I. The sentence settled through the cabin like cold air pouring through an open door. Holloway closed his eyes briefly. Around him, passengers no longer looked at Isaiah with curiosity. They looked at him with something closer to shame. Claire slowly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Every assumption she had made that night now replayed through her mind in unbearable detail. The hoodie. The seat. The suspicion in her own voice. The certainty that he could not possibly belong there. Isaiah finally spoke again, his voice quiet enough that everyone leaned forward unconsciously to hear it. Ms. Grant, he said calmly, I have not made my final decision yet. The entire cabin froze again. Even Holloway looked stunned. Eleanor paused briefly on the speakerphone. You are still willing to reconsider? Isaiah turned slowly toward the rain-covered window beside him. I am still deciding whether this company is capable of learning the difference between status and dignity. The cabin remained silent after Isaiah Brooks spoke. Rain drifted softly across the airplane windows, turning the runway lights outside into long blurred streaks of gold and blue. Nobody inside first class seemed comfortable breathing too loudly anymore. Richard Holloway sat across from Isaiah with both hands clasped together, staring down at the carpet as though the weight of the entire airline rested there beneath his shoes. Daniel Mercer quietly lowered the speakerphone after Eleanor Grant disconnected the call. The tension that remained afterward somehow felt even heavier than her voice had. Claire Whitmore stood near the aisle with trembling fingers pressed together in front of her uniform. The polished confidence she carried earlier that night had completely disappeared. She looked smaller now, exposed beneath the soft cabin lighting and the eyes of every passenger around her. Slowly, she stepped closer to Isaiah again. Her heels barely made a sound against the carpet. When she finally spoke, her voice shook. I spent years believing I could recognize who belonged in places like this, she said quietly. Isaiah looked at her calmly but said nothing. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. I told myself I was protecting standards. But the truth is, I stopped seeing people as human long before tonight. Several passengers lowered their eyes. A man near row 3 quietly removed his glasses and stared toward the rain outside. Claire's breathing became uneven. You walked onto this plane dressed simply, speaking calmly, treating everyone respectfully. Her eyes glistened beneath the overhead lights now. And somehow I still decided you were the problem. Isaiah rested one arm gently against the seat beside him. Because people become dangerous once society teaches them they can judge others without consequences, he replied softly. Claire nodded once, ashamed. Holloway remained silent across from them, unable to argue with a single word. Isaiah glanced around the cabin slowly. The saddest part is not what happened to me, he continued. It is how normal moments like this have become for people who look like me. Nobody moved after hearing that. The rain continued sliding quietly down the windows beside him. Claire finally lowered her head completely. I am sorry, she whispered. Isaiah studied her for several seconds before answering. Then make sure the next person who walks onto one of your flights is treated with dignity before they have to earn it. The silence that followed felt different now. Not hostile. Not tense. Just painfully honest. Isaiah Brooks stood slowly from seat 2A while the cabin remained completely silent around him. Nobody reached for a phone anymore. Nobody whispered. The tension that once filled first class had settled into something quieter now, something heavier than embarrassment. Outside the airplane windows, the rain had almost stopped completely. Thin drops clung to the glass beneath the pale runway lights, turning the night outside soft and blurred like a fading memory. Isaiah reached calmly for the small carry-on bag beside his seat and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. His black hoodie still looked simple beneath the warm cabin lights, but nobody saw it the same way anymore. Claire Whitmore watched him from the aisle with exhausted eyes. The sharp confidence that defined her earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by the painful awareness of someone forced to confront who they had become. Richard Holloway slowly stood as Isaiah stepped into the aisle. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "I hope this company earns another chance someday." Isaiah paused for a moment but did not immediately turn around. "Companies do not change because of statements," he replied softly. "They change when people inside them decide dignity matters more than appearances." Holloway lowered his eyes without answering. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked ashamed for staying silent earlier. Others stared quietly at Isaiah as though trying to remember every word he had spoken. Isaiah finally walked toward the open aircraft door at the front of the cabin. The soft rolling sound of his suitcase wheels echoed gently through first class. Claire stepped aside to let him pass. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Isaiah stopped beside her. "One bad moment does not define your entire life," he said calmly. Claire looked up slowly, surprised. "But refusing to learn from it can." Her eyes filled again, but she nodded quietly this time instead of speaking. Isaiah gave a small respectful nod before continuing toward the exit. Cool night air drifted through the open cabin door carrying the faint scent of rain and jet fuel. From the runway below. Beyond the doorway, the airport corridor stretched ahead beneath long fluorescent lights reflecting against polished floors. Isaiah walked forward alone without looking back. Behind him, the entire cabin remained still. Claire stood motionless beside the aisle watching him disappear into the quiet terminal. Holloway rested one hand against the empty first-class seat. Outside the windows, the Atlantic Meridian logo reflected across the wet runway beneath the fading storm clouds. And for the first time that night, the silence inside the aircraft no longer felt powerful. It felt honest.